So, what are some telltale signs that people are having inflammation that perhaps is stemming from the small intestine?
Right. Well, this is challenging to answer because it's very non-specific, but we can do sort of like a quick scan. Brain fog is one, as can be depression and anxiety. Coming to the thyroid gland, it's possible that someone's on thyroid medication, but they're having inconsistent symptoms and levels because they're not absorbing the thyroid hormone consistently. We actually published on this last year. So that's something for people to be aware of. If you are hypothyroid and on medication and saying, like, my levels are in flux and I can't ever feel as though it's working symptomatically, it could be that levothyroxine or Armour, whatever you're taking, it's not consistently absorbing in the small intestine, and therefore your levels and your symptoms are kind of all over the place. Uh, Adrenal dysfunction. There was a really interesting study by Ford last year that found using probiotics for IBS actually led to a regulation of the cortisol awakening response. Sorry, the
Mm.
author on this one was Quigley. So the cortisol awakening response, probably the most accurate way of assessing cortisol. And they found that people who had IBS, so gas, bloating, indigestion, pain, diarrhea, constipation, they had abnormally low levels of cortisol in the morning, a low awakening response. You want that cortisol to be high in the morning. So you get up, you get out of bed, you get on with your day. And if you don't have that cortisol awakening, you can feel like, oh, I need that cup of coffee, or it takes me like 2 hours to get going. What they found was after they treated a group of people who had IBS, their cortisol levels normalized. So it's pretty phenomenal. So even something like adrenal hormone output and the resulting energy can be implicated. And then, of course, gas, bloating, diarrhea, indigestion, constipation, bloating, pain, those are telltale signs. But you may even have something like joint pain, skin eruptions that you can't figure out why you're having those. So symptoms alone are kind of tough, but you can look for correlation. Like I was saying earlier, you may notice you're feeling well, you eat something, you have something like, let's say, bloating, and at the same time, your joints feel kind of inflamed or you feel foggy. That's one of the ways to sort of look to see, is it the gut that's driving this? And just
Mm.
for some figures, IBS affects 15 to 20% of the US population, and then a broader category known as functional gastrointestinal disorders. So we can put non-IBS constipation, reflux, GERD in there. That can be up to 40% of the US population. So, it's not an uncommon thing for the gut to be involved in driving any one of this sort of wide list of symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, that's my story. I had IBS back in my early 20s as a personal trainer. And that's really what got me into actually natural health, functional medicine that led me into it because I had to use that in order to get well naturally because modern medicine really didn't
Right.
have good answers for me. And, one of the things that I used was probiotics, which, back in the early 2000s, it's like probiotics were amazing. That was, one of the not it was not talked about often, but you could find it at a health food store and they were very effective. And they still are. And I know you've done a lot of research. We've had conversations about probiotics. Um, you're one of the few practitioners that really likes to talk a lot about probiotics. Used to be real popular 15 years ago, in the natural health space. Now people are talking about all kinds of other things, kind of
Whatever's
overlooking
in vogue. Yeah.
some of the
Yeah.
great benefits of probiotics. But
Right.
what are you seeing with probiotics, and what are some of the mechanisms for how probiotics help improve small intestinal health?
Right. Well, firstly, I wish I was in your boat because when I was going through my gut health disarray, it didn't really come up. It was
Mm.
antimicrobials, 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 which is all fine and good. And that's a part of the toolkit, an important part. But boy, to your point, yeah, like it was just not really discussed, at least in the circles that I was in, which is unfortunate, right? But now, probiotics are getting much more recognition. And also, I agree with you that other things, there's always a thing, the thing in
Yeah.
vogue, whatever it is. But man, there's a lot of research on probiotics. There's hundreds of clinical trials, dozens of meta-analyses summarizing these clinical trials, and they work in a few different ways. The one thing that I think is underappreciated about probiotics, they're antimicrobial. They fight SIBO. Over 10 clinical
Mm.
trials have found that probiotics can eradicate SIBO, which is amazing, right? You don't necessarily need herbal antimicrobials or an antibiotic.
Yeah, most people think
There,
SIBO, it's too much bacteria, right? So with SIBO, like you had mentioned earlier, it's like we have a high propensity of bacteria in our large intestine. We should have a much lower population of bacteria in the small intestine. And when the bacterial levels increase in the small intestine, that's going to contribute to a lot of these symptoms that we talked about. So
right.
the idea is, hey, if we're throwing more bacteria in there, that shouldn't be good, right? If we're trying to,
Right.
if we already have too much in the small intestine, but like you said, it's got this antimicrobial effect where the probiotics in there are actually helping either it's the probiotics killing the bacteria, or maybe they're stimulating the immune system to
Yep.
reduce
Yep.
bacterial populations.
Yeah. I mean, very well said. And thank you for defining SIBO. Sometimes you just jump right into the
Yeah.
nitty gritty. And ironically, the probiotics might be the most needed in the small intestine for the very reasons that you're raising, which is not only are they antibacterial through release of things like bacteriocins, but they also modulate the immune system. We have all these receptors, as I know you know, right? But things like toll-like receptor 4 that
Hmm.
regulates leaky gut, that can be positively stimulated, and you can resolve leaky gut also with probiotics, which has been shown in a meta-analysis in Frontiers in Immunology published just last year, 2023. Super exciting. And then along with that, they seem to improve probiotics, that is, food tolerance. And that's part of the immune system. And this is where, most namely in lactose intolerance, it's been demonstrated that probiotics can improve lactose tolerance. And part of this might be due to the fact that inflammation in the intestine may impede your local release of enzymes. And this might be why the lactose tolerance improves.
Mm.
This is more theoretical, but if the lining of the intestine is damaged, where you release these enzymes, and part of the enzymes come from the brush border or the sort of villi, if they're damaged, they can't release the enzymes. If you can't release the enzymes, you can't break down the food. If you can't break down the food, the bacteria end up breaking it down, right? And this is why people can have
Hmm.
things like diarrhea because of excess
Mm.
fermentation and gas, and this sort of causes this purging sort of effect. And motility. There's some really impressive research showing that probiotics are pro-motility. And then coming back up to the brain, and some of the research that has found improvements in activation of the limbic system. One really elegant study, and this is the one by Ford, they found that giving people probiotics improved their IBS symptoms, so less digestive symptoms, but at the same time, the amygdala was less activated. So this part of the brain inside the limbic system that regulates the fear response. And I think for a lot of us with gut symptoms, that fear response is a big deal,
Mm.
meaning you care about your health, right? You're motivated. So you're reading books, you're watching videos, you're listening to podcasts, and you hear about lectins, oxalates, salicylates, FODMAPs, gluten, dairy, processed foods, sweeteners. And before you know it, you're just afraid of almost everything. And it's the limbic system that's regulating that fear. And it can be turned up too much. So what's really interesting is that probiotics also seem to have a mechanistic benefit in the brain by attenuating this limbic system that kind of keeps people both psychologically on guard, but it also keeps their immune system too much of sort of being on this alert status, and can
Mm.
be part of the reason why people have food reactivity. So that's just a few, but I think some of the more salient mechanisms regarding probiotics.